My video on. Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. Many of us have been active feminists since the 1970s or even the 60s, and we were not surprised when this new attack on women came along. We have not changed our analysis. We wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights in 2018, drawing on this knowledge, radical feminist knowledge of attacks on women. And it lays out our position. It's been signed by 39,470 people from 160 countries and is supported by 547 organizations. So to promote the declaration, we have volunteer activists, country contacts in every continent. Do join us. You can also become a member of WDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. info@womensdeclaration.com or on the website. So today our program is great and it's going to be very interesting. We have Pauline Kranendonk from the Netherlands, and she is going to talk about Gender and Language, the sequel. Then we're going to hear from Felicia Rembrandt, and her talk is called The Canadian Election and the Wall of Silence. And then we're going to hear from Jill Ovens from New Zealand, and her talk is Renting Wombs and Buying Babies. So our first speaker is Pauline Kranendonk. She's from the Netherlands. She's a feminist activist, and her talk is called Gender and Language, the sequel. So welcome, Pauline.
I'm going to talk about language again. I gave a talk about gender and language at Feminist Question Time in 2019. So this could be called the sequel. WDI was still called Women's Human Rights Campaign at the time. I'd almost forgotten about that. And I talked about the importance of language in the fight against gender ideology and how language influences our thinking, and vice versa. And while all this is still true today, 6 years on, a lot has changed. And recently, developments have been going really fast. We've had the Cast Review in the UK, which exposed the abuse taking place behind the doors of the Tavistock Clinic. A number of countries, as a result, have done their own reviews and abandoned the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in children. The WPATH files have revealed the inner workings of an evil lobby group, I think you could say. In the US, Trump has issued an executive order declaring there are only two sexes. He actually said two genders in his press conference. In the UK, the Supreme Court recently ruled that in equality law, sex refers to sex and women means women. In Europe, national and European Parliament elections have shown a rise of right-wing parties that reject gender ideology generally. Elon Musk bought Twitter, as you will remember. I will still keep calling it Twitter forever, and brought back many of the critics of gender ideology to Twitter. And at the same time, the resistance movement against gender ideology has been growing and consolidating. WDI is a great example of that. Since its beginnings in 2018, it's been able to amass, as you just said, Joe, I just checked it on your website, almost 40,000 signatories of this declaration from 160 countries, and you have country contacts all over the world. It's really amazing from that first time in Philia where you stood up and asked, like, are there any other women here who want to join this? Because it was really just a few of you who started that. And now every week you bring together hundreds of women in this webinar to listen to the most amazing and interesting speakers. And I think I can speak for all of us when I say that every speaker makes us want to be braver. At least that's how it is for me. In that last talk in 2019, I cited Millicent Fawcett's quote, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." And her call has been heeded as we see increasing numbers of women and men speaking up around the world. And we seem to have broken the no debate rule that so successfully helped the gender lobby pass laws and change the rules in countries around the world. And as people have started speaking up, the horrors behind the movement have become exposed. Breaking the silence has probably been the most important thing we've done. And countries like Canada, the US, and Australia that at first had trouble organizing, partly because of their geography, are now mobilizing and having the debate. And I'd be remiss not to mention J.K. Rowling, who decided to speak out in 2019 and has been fearlessly shedding light on this issue ever since. There have been many legal cases that have been started. Some have been lost, but many have been won. We're all crossing our fingers for Sal Grover in her upcoming appeal. Some countries have passed self-ID laws, but in others, like the Netherlands, my own country, they were shelved. But gone are the days when such laws could be passed surreptitiously without any public debate. The times of no debate are over. Pandora's box has been opened and she's not going back in. Today, I would like to take a look at where we stand with language given all of these developments. So how does the gender ideology lobby use language and why? There are several ways in which it uses language to push its agenda. So one of the ways is by appropriating the language of civil rights movements, including the women's rights movement, the Black civil rights movement in the United States, and the gay rights movement. You will see in this picture, for example, trans rights or human rights, which was taken from Hillary Clinton's statement in Beijing in '95, women's rights or human rights. You will see trans power, which refers to Black power. I like the one in the middle at the bottom, trans rights, or it actually says men's rights if you look at it like this, unintentionally. Defend LGBTQ plus communities, of course, refers to the gay rights movement. And then, I don't know if it's very easy to see, but in the top middle, you see my body, my choice, which of course refers to being able to modify your body for young people. But it's of course stolen from the reproductive rights movement. So other examples are, for example, trans rights activism framing this movement as a human rights movement, and also several terms that are taken from other human rights terminology like genocide, vulnerable group, discrimination, exclusion, the suffix phobia, as in transphobia, queer phobia, and other variations. Anti-trans groups, which of course WDI is a part of, anti-trans rights, which can be an article or any kind of source can be anti-trans rights if it talks about women's rights. An anti-trans author, for example. You have the word hate, which is used to designate even saying the truth can be reframed as hate. There's the gay terminology of the gay rights movement, like coming out, first openly transgender person in such and such role, living freely, being yourself. Another way the gender ideology lobby uses language is by gaslighting. So telling people that they can't believe their own eyes, lying, asking other people to lie. So this can include describing rapists as women, declaring a man woman of the year, allowing men in sports and telling the women and the girls that these are women and that they need to compete against them, get undressed in the changing rooms, etc. An article from Huffington Post that was published in April, right after the UK Supreme Court ruling. And it talks about a sort of reverse feminism. And of course, it calls it anti-trans rhetoric. The cover of Vogue, this was on International Women's Day 2018. I dare you to spot the man in the picture. This was an issue for, because of International Women's Day, about the suffragettes. So this was looking back at 100 years women's suffrage, and these are the new suffragettes. 100 years since women were first granted the right to vote, a new kind of suffragist is rising. There's Paris Lee's, the campaign of raising awareness for men. Okay, it doesn't say that. It actually says raising awareness for trans people, but I'm trying to rephrase, because how would this article sound if you just use normal language and use terms that mean something? And if you talk about women's suffrage and you talk about a campaign of raising awareness for men, it becomes clear how absolutely absurd that article is. So here we have some more examples. Paris Lees's work to educate the world about the lived experience of men, including how it feels to be the subject of debates on what it means to be a woman. I understand older feminist wariness of men, but it's been misdirected on men. Yes, going back to what I was saying about the gaslighting. So the goal of that, of the gaslighting and the lying and making people go along with the lie, is to hide inconvenient truths from the public and to force people to get used to this strange new language, a newspeak, if you will, to force vulnerable groups to accept adult men in their spaces, and you know all of the other consequences that this has in real life. So this next slide is an example of another goal of the use of language by the gender ideology lobby, which is to confuse us. Now, if you read this, if you want to know what a bathroom bill is, this is from Wikipedia, the common name for legislation or statute. Bathroom bills affect access to sex-segregated public facilities for an individual based on a determination of their sex as defined in some specific way, such as their sex assigned at birth, their sex as listed on their birth certificate, or the sex that corresponds to their gender identity. Honestly, I have no idea what this means. And I'm pretty used to reading this type of language, but it's just absolutely unclear. And this is just one example of how this jargon is used to confuse us. It makes us feel like we're not, there's some kind of education that you need to get to understand it. And if you don't understand it, it's because you're uninformed or maybe a little bit stupid. And so you're not going to give your opinion. This is another example of confusing language, which I'm not even sure is intentional. This is the EU directive on violence against women and domestic violence. It has a very clear title. It has women in the title. You would think, okay, it must be for women. The definition of violence against women is very clear and very good. It does use the word gender-based violence, but it says means all acts of gender-based violence directed against a woman or a girl because she is a woman or a girl, or that affect women or girls disproportionately. So that's a very good definition. So we continue in this document. You can look for the different ways in which the word gender is used. So here it's used in the more feminist meaning of sex-based roles, a hierarchy where men dominate and women are supposed to be submissive. So it mentions harmful gender stereotypes, inferiority of women, stereotyped roles, children are exposed to gender roles, etc. And so here we see another meaning of gender. So it starts out very good. Again, the measures under this directive are designed to address the specific needs of women and girls because they are mainly disproportionately affected by violence against women and domestic violence. I mean, that makes sense. It's kind of circular because you think it's violence against women, so it's actually only women and girls. But no, there's a but. However, other persons also fall victim. This could only be men and boys because there's no other type of person than men and women, obviously. Other persons also fall victim to those forms of violence and should therefore also benefit from the same measures for victims provided for in this directive. Therefore, the term victim should refer to all persons regardless of their gender. This is more or less when I fell off my chair, because this means that this entire directive, which could have such an incredible impact on women who suffer from domestic violence, sexual violence, male violence in general, women and girls, and it actually undoes everything, because if anybody can be a victim and can be considered a victim, then it's really not intended for women at all. There is no real protection behind it. And I think this probably comes from a desire to be inclusive. It may have been well intended, but it really waters down entirely the impact of such an important directive. And this is where we see how important the language is in this type of legislation. So this is about specialist support services for victim support. So that could be rape victims, victims of domestic violence, so victims of male violence. And it says such support should be provided by a person of the same gender where requested or appropriate. Now, we've seen in the examples that I've given that the word gender has been used in different meanings And it's absolutely unsure if this means, especially as they mentioned, persons of any gender, that could, persons of all genders, I think it was, that means that gender really doesn't mean sex. So it means that even though there is such a clause in the legislation that if a person says that they are female, they should be accepted by a rape victim, for example, as at a support service.
Excuse me, I'm a student journalist. Would you mind answering a couple questions?
Sure.
Is that all right for everyone?
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit about your organization and why you guys are out here today?
So we're called Let Women Speak, and we meet monthly to exercise our right for free speech for women, specifically women.
And what parts of free speech do you think is being infringed upon?
All. Any free speech that's infringed upon is all parts of free speech. So you should. Do you mean what do I want to speak about that I can't?
Yeah.
So that might be that women don't have penises, that women deserve spaces away from men, that a man who calls himself a woman is not one, that you shouldn't transition children.
So, how are trans women infringing on cis women's spaces?
So men in women's spaces makes it no longer a women's space, so we don't have a right to a woman's space if a man is allowed in it.
Have you ever felt personally unsafe with a trans woman in your presence?
Have I felt unsafe with men in my presence? Yes, 100%.
Trans women?
Yeah, men. So that would be free speech. If you say you're for free speech and you're...
Yeah, I think this is such a fantastic example of how to use language. Kelly J. Keane really, she is extremely clever in what she does here. It seems a bit like a ping pong game when you listen to it. But what she does is very conscious. She not only uses normal language, calling men men, but when the interviewer tries to impose her language on Kelly J, she keeps responding consistently in normal language. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because we do tend to mirror other people's speech in conversations. So when people use certain words, we tend to use those same words, even if we wouldn't maybe normally use them. And it's quite difficult to move away from language that your conversational partner is trying to make you use, which is, of course, what's happening here. This interviewer knows very well what she's doing. She's trying to correct Kelly J's language, and she's not having it. And one particularly clever trick that Kelly J uses is to repeat the question using normal language. And I think that is just so brilliant. So she is asked, have you ever felt personally unsafe with a trans woman in your presence? And she repeats the question, have I felt unsafe with men in my presence? Yes. Trans women, says the woman. And she says, yeah, men. So she keeps correcting the interviewer, refusing to, because by answering the question, by saying yes or no, you're actually accepting the language the other person is using. And it's very clear that the question changes completely when she says, have I felt unsafe with men in my presence? Yes, I think any woman or girl would have to say yes to that question. Whereas it sounds completely different and quite innocuous when you say trans woman, and it actually sounds like it's like an opening to make you sound like a bigot. And so this is a very, very clever tactic. And in fact, she is kind of rebutting the language trick that the interviewer is trying on her. She's reversing it. And it's particularly powerful because it also exposes the manipulation, the attempted manipulation by the interviewer. And she also calls this out at the end of the interview. So she actually names the attempt at manipulation of the interviewer. And that's also a very powerful way to counter this tactic, which is very, very common. Now, Kelly J. Keane has been very good at using normal language, but if I remember correctly, she did once say that she also started out using gender ideology-based language, as I'm sure many of us did. And I think most of us, as we were exposed to this ideology for the first time, adopted this language because that's what you do when you're new to a topic. We didn't realize that there was actually an assault on our rights going on, and we didn't know that language was one of the biggest weapons that was used in that assault. But Kelly J. Keane realized early on how important using reality-based language, in other words, normal language, was in fighting back. She's been doing this for years, and the way that she reacted in this video is the result of years of training herself to speak normal language. This is my interpretation, but that's what I think. And this is something that we can all do. And so there are some ways that you can, some things that you can do to train yourself. Be conscious of using normal language. And by that, I mean, use only words if you can explain clearly what they mean. Don't mindlessly use words of other people, even if they're like-minded people. This can be difficult if you've been following this topic for a long time, because if you're regularly exposed to certain language, it starts to become normal. So ask yourself, what language are you using today that you were not using 5 or 10 years ago? And what do these words really mean? Can you give yourself a definition of them? Secondly, think about the use of uncommon terms and abbreviations like TIM, AGP, TRA, even TERF, especially when you're talking to people who aren't really familiar with the topic. The gender lobby tells people who are in any way critical or questioning of gender ideology to educate themselves, as if it's a question, the question what a man and a woman are is a very complicated thing. And using unusual terms that people don't know very well makes it sound like you're part of an in crowd who knows something that they don't know. And your listener may be inclined to come away thinking, look, I don't know enough about this topic to have an opinion. I will just stay quiet about it. And so try to keep it simple. When people use gender ideology-based slurs, for example, don't get defensive. Don't start explaining if they call you, for example, far right or a neo-Nazi or a feminist or what, I don't know how you pronounce this, faux feminist. All of these words that are hurled at people who are critical, don't feel you need to explain. So you can, this is just a way to try and shut you up, to silence you. It's not intended for you to explain that, no, you're really not right wing or whatever. It's only intended to shut you up. So just keep talking, keep using normal language, and ignore those comments. And they can't hurt you unless they don't have any power over you, unless the person saying them has power over you. Then it's a different matter. You need to be more careful, but that's rarely the case. When people use gender ideology-based language, don't feel that you need to explain, just keep using normal language. When you point out, for example, the problem with men coming into spaces where women get naked, and someone else reframes that as excluding trans women from the spaces they identify with, or we've all heard those kinds of wordings, don't explain why that is nonsensical. Don't explain why you use certain language, just keep going. And linked to that, when people are rephrasing your words, use the broken record technique. For the people who don't know records, that's when the record doesn't continue and it keeps repeating the same thing. So just keep saying, stick to one message. Think about one key message or question. If you want to have a conversation that's important, for example, with HR or your union or somebody who takes decisions that matter, or like counselors or anyone that can take decisions that are important, fix that message in your head. Keep repeating that message using normal language. No matter what the other person says, just keep saying that one thing. It also means they will not be able to accuse you. If you don't use the word trans, for example, because you're talking about men, you're not talking about, lesbians, for example, who say they're men. You're talking about a specific group. They can't accuse you of anything if you haven't used those words, if you're talking about men. And if the other person reframes or rephrases that message, like translated back to normal language in your reply. So basically pull a KJK. And to end, I want to quote Mahatma Gandhi. I love this quote. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I ended my talk in 2019 with the message, we will win this fight. And we're now 6 years on, and I think I can say we are finally winning this fight. The tide is truly turning, but we're not there yet. Not every country is at the same stage of resistance, and every time a battle is won, there is resistance. The war is not over yet. Language is still the main weapon for gender ideology proponents, and so there's never been a better time to start using this weapon to fight back. Gisèle Pelicot made the world realize that shame needs to change sides when it comes to sexual violence. Her saying those words after what she had been through has had a profound impact on other women who felt ashamed to speak about the sexual abuse committed against them. And in the fight against gender ideology, it's time for fear to change sides. Many of us have been rightfully scared to stand up and speak up for a long time, scared of consequences like losing our friends, losing our jobs, being sued, and other very real fears. And I'm not saying those fears are no longer justified, but the situation is quite different than from the one 6 years ago. Criticism of gender ideology is spreading fast. We're no longer a silent majority. The gender ideology lobby is under a lot of pressure, including financially. They know their time is up. Many of them make a living off pushing this agenda. And so let's make fear change sides. Let's be braver. And hopefully I will report back in less than 6 years when we've won.
So now we're going to hear from Felicia Rembrandt, and Felicia was founder of Gender Dissent, which she edited and wrote for 2 years. Since then, she has been writing for her Substack, Felicia Rembrandt Comments. She's just published her memoir, A Little Bit of God, about her recovery from childhood abuse, framed within a radical feminist analysis of the patriarchal constructs that enable child abuse. Now, note, if you are looking for the book, it's published under the name Felicia Rembrandt, and or no, Felicia Klingenberg. so look for Felicia Klingenberg and for that book. Okay, well, thank you so much, Felicia, and thanks for coming and talking. The title of Felicia's talk is The Canadian Election and the Wall of Silence. So over to you.
I'm now going to contradict many of the things that Pauline said, so I hope that's okay with everybody. The Wall of Silence. There was a federal election in Canada in April. The Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, was expected to win, as Liberal support had tanked. There's a third party, the NDP, and they were practically non-existent by that point. They continue to be practically non-existent at the federal level. As a result of the tanking of the Liberal Party, the wildly unpopular Feminist, Justin Trudeau, had stepped down and been replaced by Mark Carney. Many of you in Britain will know Mark Carney. He was a governor of the Bank of England after having been governor of the Bank of Canada. So prior to the election, there were 2 leadership debates, the first in French and the second in English. Scrums for the journalists were scheduled for after each debate, in which journalists could ask whatever questions they wanted. All journalists had been vetted. At the scrum after the first debate, some journalists from the independent media, that is, from conservative online platforms, surprised the members of the mainstream by getting to the microphones ahead of everybody else. They asked questions on subjects the mainstream media had been suppressing for years. In particular, Alex Zoltan of True North asked the Liberal leader, Mark Carney, how many sexes there are. Carney replied there were 2. Zoltan then asked him if women, biological women, were entitled to their own spaces, sports, changing rooms, etc. Carney gave a word salad sort of answer, culminating in, quote, "This is Canada. We value all Canadians for who they are and will continue to do so." Carney has a daughter who identifies as non-binary. The mainstream media was so incensed by the temerity of these independent journalists to bring up a subject they didn't want to cover, that while they were all waiting in a media room prior to the next debate, the English language debate, one verbally attacked the Indies for hogging all the question time. As Ezra Levant of Rebel News pointed out, the Indies got 4 questions and the mainstream got 4. Later, in a corridor, there was an actual physical altercation, or there may have been. Video evidence is pretty murky. The Debates Commission responded by canceling that evening's scrum. The 2 major TV networks, CBC and CTV, broadcast that this was because of safety issues, implying that the indie media had caused an environment that was no longer safe. It's worth mentioning that the indie media, Rebel News and True North, had sued the Debates Commission in previous years for the right to be accredited, and they had won. But the mainstream media accuses them of being profit-driven advertising platforms, or platforms driven by ideology rather than true journalism. I've seen both criticisms. But what is the mainstream media in Canada? The three largest television networks, CTV, Global, and CBC, get huge government grants. The CBC is actually a public broadcaster. The press in Canada is likewise indebted to government for funding to keep publishing. This has led to so much bias or potential bias that former mainstream journalists are starting podcasts and Substacks where they advertise that they have refused all government funding so that they can remain independent. One such podcaster, Trish Wood, former host of the prestigious documentary series Fifth Estate, now calls the mainstream media the cartel media, who work together as a bloc to suppress free speech. There is no critical coverage of gender medicine or gender ideology or the policy changes that resulted from the government's adoption of gender over sex as the major means by which people are categorized. And there has not been critical coverage since the Liberals under Justin Trudeau instituted those changes in 2016. The CBC in particular is fond of running sob stories about poor young men who claim to be women trapped in male bodies. The cancellation of the second scrum at the debates, caused by mainstream media outrage over the Indies asking illicit questions, strongly suggests that the MSM is in league with government to create the only agenda, the only narrative that is allowed. In Canada, that narrative is that men can be women, women can be men, and it's imperative that children be allowed to become their authentic selves through injections of puberty blockers, wrong sex hormones, and mutilating body modifications that will render them infertile, inorgasmic, and unlikely to find romantic partners among the sex of their choice. But nobody in Canada is allowed to choose romantic partners by sex anymore. That would be transphobic. We choose our partners based on gender. The media as a bloc decided that the important election issues were the ones that Carney was campaigning on, which were economic issues, particularly the threat of US President Trump and his tariffs. In their coverage, they resembled a circle of boys cheering on a fight between two men, Carney and Trump. Again and again, Carney flipped the bird at his opponent in a display of male aggression posturing. When he hit on the hockey term elbows up, he was successfully able to elbow the actual opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, aside and hook hockey-loving moms and dads into rooting for his team. This was not an election about issues. It was about which man could man up enough to beat up another man who was not even running. Conservative leader Poilievre couldn't even enter the ring, being painted as the runt version of Trump. When the dust settled and Carney had won the election, conservative commentators could blame the moms, the boomer women who voted for him, as the problem. There's always a mom to blame, isn't there? For Liberals, Carney was the hockey dad, the backyard barbecue dad. I was waiting for them to put him in a cardigan, but then they dressed him up in a hockey jersey for the win. It wasn't an election. It was a virtual Canada versus US hockey game. This is what patriarchy looks like. Good dads are still powerful patriarchs, and they exercise their power by dominating other patriarchs. The issues are not important. The impression of toughness and power is. For many, many Canadians, particularly women, the election was about women's rights, our rights to be sole proprietors of the term woman, to exclude all males from this category, and the rights of children to grow up with the truth about sex and bodies and the relation between the body and sex. Both the Conservatives and the Liberals had platform items about gender, the obstacle to these rights. The Liberal platform made multiple references to diversity on its election platform. More specifically, it listed 4 items. 1, standing up for the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, protecting the values it was founded on, which are under threat, and ensuring the protection of women, people with disabilities, racialized and Indigenous communities, and to SLGBTQI+ people. Number 2, investing in women's sexual and reproductive health care and health research, including for those within the 2SLGBTQI+ community. 3, making funding permanent for the 2 SLGBTQI plus Community Capacity Fund, and 4, adding additional funding for the LGBTQI plus International Assistance Program. The Conservative platform contained only a tiny splinter in the plank as part of its platform. It labeled this plank Restoring Public Safety. Specifically, defend women's safety by repealing Commissioner's Directive 100, which allows male offenders to be housed in women's prisons, and ensure that women's spaces and services remain protected in federal institutions and policy. That's it. Tiny. What these two platforms show is that for the Liberals, gender as a category includes women and trans ID people, with no recognition of conflict between those groups or of incompatibility between them. And the Conservatives, on the other hand, recognize that women are in danger from gender ID policies that lump women in with trans ID males. Neither leader wanted to talk about this subject, nor did the mainstream media. Poilievre could have come out against trans ideology or for women's sex-based rights, as the most recent Conservative convention had passed 2 resolutions on the subject, one of them initiated by Coach Linda Blade. The 2 resolutions were, 1, to limit transgender health care for minors, that had 69% support, and to ensure single-sex spaces for women, that had 87% support. Women were defined as female persons to exclude transgender individuals. These policies aimed to prohibit life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions excuse me, for gender-diverse youth and protect spaces like women's prisons and bathrooms. Canadian gender-critical women did everything we could on social media, particularly on Twitter X, to persuade Poilievre to speak up about this tiny portion of his platform, but to no avail. If leaders don't want to bring up a subject and the media don't want that subject advertised or promoted, then silence wins out. In one of his first speeches after winning election, Carney warned that online American platforms are becoming seas of racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate in all its forms, and promised his government would act. This was a reference to the Online Harms Act, which the previous Trudeau government had been attempting to pass. As Amy Ham wrote in the National Post, Carney has hinted that his Liberal government will bring back some iteration of Trudeau's tyrannical, there is no other word for it, Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, which was killed when the former Prime Minister prorogued Parliament this January. He had to prorogue Parliament in order to have a leadership race in advance of the election. You will recall that this now defunct legislation would have granted judges the ability to mete out life sentences for hate speech and would have created a government digital safety commission to police Canadians' speech and impose life-destroying fines upon those whose speech was deemed hateful by our government censors. Additional information was provided by a law firm analyzing the repercussions of the bill. They wrote that Bill C-63 introduces significant changes to the criminal code, including a new definition of hatred, a new hate crime of offense motivated by hatred, carrying a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, and stronger sentences for existing hate propaganda offenses, including a maximum sentence of life imprisonment for advocating or promoting genocide. Well, everybody's labeling every little bit of something that they find insulting now genocide. Who's to define genocide? It also amends, they wrote, this group of lawyers, it amends the Canadian Human Rights Act to add the communication of hate speech by means of the internet or any other means of telecommunication as a discriminatory practice. The amendments will provide individuals with the right to bring a related complaint before the Canadian Human Rights Commission and authorize the Commission to assess penalties of up to $50,000. And these fines will apply to actual users, not to the companies, but to users, people like me. So first of all, any old Josephine, man in a dress, can bring a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and that complaint can be directed at an ordinary person like me or anybody else in Canada who might say such a thing as, there's no such thing as a trans child. Just this week, Global News reported that the Carney government was indeed considering bringing back the online harms bill, perhaps as it is and perhaps with changes. In another article a couple of weeks after Ham's article, journalist Tristan Hopper wrote about the upcoming implementation of the Online Streaming Act, a 2023 law that gives the federal government the ability to control the content of the internet in Canada. Basically, it requires them to follow the same rules for Canadian content as radio and TV. And we've always had certain rules requiring, up to 30%, I think, television and radio content must be Canadian. But the language of the Online Streaming Act also goes beyond mere Canadian content by hinting that streamers may also be subject to inclusive mandates on their content. The Online Streaming Act specifically requires broadcasters to produce content that reflects Black or other racialized communities, as well as Canadians of diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions. So the government is poised to impose censorship with regards to gender ideology and to force the creation of propaganda with regards to the same thing. Ban the facts, force the fictions. In the real world, Carney's government continues along the trajectory of the Trudeau version. On June 1st, the Liberal Party Twitter account put out this message: "We're looking forward to celebrating this Pride season with you all across the country." And that's Pride season, not Pride Day, not Pride Week, not Pride Month, but Pride season, the entire summer. Carney raised the Progress flag on Parliament Hill on June 1st and wished Canadians happy Pride. His government gave extra funding of $1.5 million to the Fierté Society to enhance safety and security at Pride events, reflecting a response to increasing backlash against LGBTQ+ rights. So, he and his government are aware that there is an increasing backlash, but there is no questioning of why. Rechie Valdez, the new Minister of Women and Gender Equality, which is known as WAGE, that's the government ministry, issued this communique on Pride. The Government of Canada is removing barriers still faced by two SLGBTQI communities, from safe access to gender-affirming care to opportunities in entrepreneurship and skilled trades. Through the federal 2 SLGBTQI+ Action Plan and Canada's Action Plan on Combating Hate, we're funding solutions that improve safety, support mental health, and strengthen community resilience. That's from her communique. And that includes a $25 million federal investment in Canada's first ever 2 SLGBTQI+ entrepreneurship program, launched in partnership with the Canadian 2 SLGBTQI+ Chamber of Commerce. She writes that Pride is both a celebration and a call to action, and the government will continue to stand with 2 SLGBTQI+ communities to build a safer, more inclusive, and more equitable Canada for all. WAGE's departmental plan for 2025, also issued by Rechie Valdez, incorporates 2 SLGBTQI+ into its mandate. From the plan, I'm quoting, "Addressing discrimination against 2 SLGBTQI+ communities continues to be a key focus. In times where 2 SLGBTQI+ rights are being threatened, WAGE will lead the rollout of Canada's first 2 SLGBTQI+ national survey to further understand the current needs of the community. As well, we will provide $1.5 million in funding to meet security needs for Pride festivals and continue to promote the 2 SLGBTQI+ anti-stigma campaign." All the trans and queer initiatives are located within the department that is supposed to be about and for women. This placement reflects the government's belief that there is no conflict between women and men who claim to be women. Support for the 2S LGBTQI+ falls naturally to women. Support for one is support for the other. Now, it's possible that it's more sinister than that. I'm beginning to have a suspicion that the Department of Women and Gender Equality is actually the Department of non-white, non-straight, non-men. In other words, anybody who is not the most important and powerful demographic in society. I suspect that we are all being othered into one broad category, a sort of junk category. Carney has appointed former Justice Minister David Lametti as his principal secretary. Lametti shepherded the anti-conversion therapy bill through Parliament, the one that criminalizes all therapeutic interventions for gender-confused children and forces Canadians to affirm the lie that they are the sex they're not, and importantly, to have no preference for natural children. Lametti also had a role in the Emergencies Act invoked to stop the COVID protesters and freeze the bank accounts of the truckers back when we had the truckers convoy. In other words, to criminalize protests. So what has changed since I last spoke here on Feminist Question Time in 2022? The government's position is intractable. It still holds to the beliefs it held in 2016 when Trudeau brought his plan to replace sex with gender for all legal and administrative purposes out of hiding through Bill C-16. It was a government coup against the people. I hate to say it, but I think things are worse now than they were in 2016 because the trans cult has been drowning in government funding. It is big and bloated, and certain parts of it are becoming more and more powerful. And for 10 years, we had basically a man baby as our leader, and now we have the actual man behind him. Carney was the man behind Trudeau, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, if not from the very beginning. So what have we got, to fight this? Well, we have a promising new organization in the Free Speech Union of Canada, led by Executive Director Lisa Bildy, the lawyer who has been working on behalf of Amy Ham. And I'm sure you all know Amy Ham, the nurse who was tormented by the BC Nurse and Midwives Association. In an interview with Megan Murphy, Bildy laid out the 4 areas of engagement that the Free Speech Union will pursue. First, it will build a community of people aware of the need for freedom of expression and the dangers that will follow if it's lost. Second, it will create a legal network of lawyers with the desire and experience in pursuing court cases when someone's freedom of expression seems to have been curtailed. Third, it will campaign against harmful legislation. And fourth, it will work with international sister organizations because the Free Speech Union is international. All of these things are vital at this time when it seems people in Canada just aren't aware of the need for vigorous debate about all kinds of issues. Democracy hinges on it. The Free Speech Union has already begun tweeting about the dangers of the online harms bill. Secondly, the National Post. It is one of Canada's 2 national newspapers. It's a respected member of the mainstream media. It is increasing its coverage of criticisms of gender ideology. 2 or 3 years ago, it had some tentative efforts to offer balance to outright criticism. It now is moving more and more to criticism. It platforms both Amy Ham and Mia Hughes, the author of the WPATH files, and it gives space to intermittent other people as well. But Amy Ham seems to have a regular column. I think it might be twice a month. And Mia Hughes has already been featured twice as well. So Ham, Hughes, and Bildy are women to watch. Linda Blade is still a force too, but she's currently living in India. For institutions, I think we only have the National Post and the Free Speech Union, and I'm putting a lot of my hope in the Free Speech Union. Lisa Bildy is a real force, and she has come head to head with one of the most vicious proponents of trans ideology in Canada. We need people, particularly women with voices, with the ability to be heard. That's what we have not had. We can't change minds in Canada as long as our voices are censored. The lies and falsehoods of the trans cult have been exposed in the US and the UK with the help of right-wing media. We don't have the rabid far-right media that they have in the US, and I don't think anybody seriously wants it. But we need to find ways to force our governments to listen. And we need to do that before they clamp down via an Online Harms Act, more hate speech legislation, and forced propaganda.
Okay, so we're going to hear from Jill, the pre-recorded video, and I'm just going to get the title. Is Renting Wombs and Buying Babies?
So a couple of weeks ago, I was part of an expert panel on surrogacy, which with the UN Special Rapporteur Reem El Salem and women from all over the world. It was on Zoom. And I got invited to participate because the Women's Declaration International New Zealand and Women's Rights Party, we did a joint response to their call that was put out, because the Special Rapporteur is preparing a report on surrogacy that she's going to present to the UN General Assembly in early October. And it sounds like a big deal, and indeed it is, because out of this process could become recommendations for international action to curb or ban the trafficking of women and babies through the surrogacy industry, which of course at the heart of it internationally is about renting wombs and buying babies. So there was about 30 panellists from all over Europe and South America, the UK, Australia, and most of them were opposed to surrogacy as a form of exploitation of women and children. The exception was a man from an Australian group called Rainbow Families, who has a 4-year-old girl with his partner through surrogacy, and he explained that while he was in the meeting, his daughter was with her other dad in ballet class, and I'm sure other dad is thought to be very stunning and brave. Anyway, we discussed celebrity surrogacy and the glorification of, what's the deliberate act of taking a baby from its mother to satisfy career ambitions and personal preferences and the need for status symbols. And of course, there are very well-known celebrities who have had children by surrogacy. Some of them have had 2 or more surrogate-born children, and many of them are single male parents or gay male couples and aged in their 50s or beyond. So social reasons, including celebrity influences, was identified as a factor in the big increase in surrogacy. The topics for discussion were divvied up 1 hour at a time, the first being the children's right to know and be cared for by their parents, including a child's right to information on being born through surrogacy. In our policy, the Women's Rights Party, we say that children are not a commodity to be handed over as part of a transactional arrangement, and thus we support our country's ban on commercial surrogacy. I reported that the New Zealand government has been considering new surrogacy arrangements since 2021 under the then Labour government, and the proposed legislation aimed to simplify surrogacy processes and establish clear mechanisms to enforce surrogacy arrangements. We've strongly opposed that original Labour bill because it didn't protect either the interests of the birth mother or the baby, and failed to recognise that even in utero an unborn baby is already interacting with her or his birth mother physically and psychologically. But this new revised bill at least now puts the surrogate born child at the centre which has come out of the Law Commission looking at the original bill. And so one thing that we do have is that the children, all of those actually involved in the surrogacy arrangement, have the opportunity to learn about the genetic and gestational origins and whakapapa. So, but there is a mechanism to allow them to access that information in the future, but it's restricted. It's on a restricted part of the Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages. So it's proposed in the revised bill that until the birth mother of a surrogate-born baby relinquishes her legal parentage of the baby, she's the sole parent and guardian of the baby. However, in the case of an approved surrogacy that happens through a surrogacy service, like a fertility provider services, it's proposed that the intending parents, commissioning parents, could be additional guardians of the baby until the parentage of the baby's transferred, and that to us seems inconsistent with the time period that's provided for the birth mother to fully consider her decision. So the second question we're asked to consider is the question of consent of a surrogate mother, and to what extent, under what conditions it can be free and informed. So New Zealand law does not currently afford any automatic rights to the intending parents of a baby born of surrogacy. So at the time of birth, the child's legal parents are the birth mother and her partner, if he or she agrees, and a formal adoption process is required to complete the arrangement. You can't actually enforce any previous agreement that's been made. For example, go to the court to get a compliance order. So we've supported that current adoption process because it does at least provide for the interests of the birth mother as the first legal parent, with rights to her reproductive autonomy and freedom from exploitation during her pregnancy and birth. By contrast with the current adoption process, the original government bill, Labor government bill, would have provided the intending parents with automatic legal status at the point custody of the child was transferred, which could have been at the birth. So even in this current revised bill, the birth mother cannot relinquish her legal right to the baby until after a 7-day period, which we don't think really is enough. After all, in New Zealand, if you get a puppy from a breeder, you can't get it till it's 8 weeks old. So human babies are treated worse than puppies. But some panellists didn't agree that we should even be engaging in discussions to legislate and liberalise surrogacy arrangements, because that normalises a practice and legitimates a practice that inevitably violates women's physical and reproductive integrity. So we agree that the surrogacy arrangements that are currently being proposed here can never eliminate the coercive element inherent in the practice of surrogacy, even in the case of altruistic arrangements. So in our recent round of Women's Rights Party regional meetings, one woman talked about how her sister couldn't have a baby, and she was very worried that her sister would ask her because she would feel obliged to carry a baby for her sister, even though she herself had already had 3 and didn't want any further pregnancies. So she was really relieved when her sister didn't ask. And other members who had been adopted at birth said little thoughts given to the long-term interests of surrogate-born babies or their birth mothers, and they likened surrogacy to the widespread practice in the 1950s and 1960s of taking babies of unwed teen mothers from their mothers, from their mothers at birth, and putting the babies up for adoption. And many of those babies, now adults and in our meetings, and the mothers too, who were 15 or 16 at the time, suffer intense grief to this day, even where the adoptive parents provide a loving home. So, but the fact is that New Zealand's not alone in reviewing our surrogacy laws. As you know, that's happening in Australia and in the UK. And so we think we should engage in the legislative process to try and protect the rights of birth mothers and babies. So, and that's because there's a big push by commissioning parents to make sure that the arrangements that they make are enforceable. And also, it's possible that birth mothers, surrogate mothers may fear that the intended parents will not assume responsibility for their baby, especially if the baby's born with a disability or of the wrong sex. So it's become a real problem because of the development of technologies such as assisted reproductive technology and in vitro fertilization, which have opened the door to a boom in surrogacy involving egg harvesting and embryo transfers, where the surrogate mother may be carrying a baby that's not genetically related to her, which wouldn't have been the case in the past. And that raises very significant ethical issues for women relating to their reproductive freedom, health and well-being. So the third topic we were asked to consider was policy recommendations for the report. And there was at time heated debate as we discussed abolition of surrogacy, with some suggesting criminalising the commissioning parents, similar to the Nordic model of criminalising buyers and prostitution. I got the impression, though, that most supported bans on international surrogacy from countries like New Zealand, where commercial surrogacy is illegal. But even here, of course, the presence of fertility services promoting surrogacy services on our TV screens to those with the financial ability to pay for such services means that surrogacy is a commercial service and the women and babies commodities in a commercial transaction through the third party, that is the fertility service. It was good to hear from the Spanish and Italian panellists who reported that surrogacy is illegal in both of their countries, and in fact several EU countries prohibit surrogacy, but of course citizens routinely skirt the ban by hiring surrogates in foreign countries and registering the children abroad. And so we had from Italy, they were very strong in talking about how the government had cracked down on having a baby abroad and making that a criminal act. And Amparo will know that surrogacy has been prohibited in Spain since 2006, but recently the Spanish government has banned its embassies from registering children born through surrogates in foreign countries. So in New Zealand, the authorities do warn that international surrogacy is a real problem, and we have a process by which children born through international surrogacy don't automatically meet the requirements of citizenship in New Zealand, and even if there's a genetic link between one or both of the intending parents. And the child will in most cases only have temporary immigration status in New Zealand until such time as an adoption process has been completed. So the argument was made that it was up to countries with stronger regulations to take action to ban their citizens from accessing surrogacy in permissive countries, as Spain and Italy have done. Surrogate mothers, of course, often live in countries where there is widespread poverty, weak regulations and laws around surrogacy, and poor health standards, which increases the risk of humanitarian problems, where the surrogate mother and child may be vulnerable and their rights not well protected. So just to conclude, having a baby, of course, via surrogacy is not a human right. I think that point was really clearly made. There is no societal duty to provide babies to those who cannot have their own children, and certainly no requirement on poorer countries to provide babies for citizens of wealthier nations. I like this comment from one of the panel participants, Anna Kerr, who's well known to WDI, who pointed out, oh no, it wasn't her, somebody else, that where international adoption was banned in many countries, the market dried up and orphanages were empty. Anna's comment was this: if there was no market for surrogacy, this would not be a problem. We need a public health campaign raising awareness of the unique importance of the attachment between a mother and child, the significant risks of child sex abuse, and the important safeguarding role played by mothers in keeping children safe.